me again. In these videos, I document Portuguese knitting, what I'm working on, what I'm learning, and the thoughts that come up while I knit. I'm trying a slightly different format again for this episode. Instead of following a strict script, I wrote myself a few notes and questions, so if you hear me pause, I'm probably just checking what comes next. Lately, I've been watching a lot of knitting podcasts, especially while I knit, and I realized that they've really changed the way I experience this hobby. So today, I wanted to share some of my current favorites, not as a ranking, but more as a reflection of what I've been enjoying and why. I'll be talking about a few podcasts that I watch regularly, some that I'm still exploring, and a couple of channels that I don't necessarily follow as podcasts, but that I often go back to when I need to learn something. And while I talk, I'll just be knitting. I've recently started working on some summer pieces, trying to use the yarn I already have, mostly cotton, and figuring things out as I go. The first podcast I want to mention is one that I started watching recently, and honestly, I connected with it straight away. It's called That Portuguese Knitter. There's something about the way Eunice speaks and the way she lives knitting that really resonated with me. It's a bit hard to explain, but it's that feeling where you don't know the person, but you feel like you understand them. I think part of that comes from the fact that she's Portuguese and actually from the same town where I live. And I feel like we share similar concerns, being more sustainable, not buying yarn in excess, and trying to use what we already have. I also really like her tone. She speaks very calmly, and it's just very easy to listen to. She has a young son. I have two children, but around the same age. So there are also small things that I relate to there. I ended up watching all of her episodes in a row, which for me is not unusual because I almost always have something playing while I knit. One thing I also found interesting is that she knits Portuguese style. I don't always see her knitting on screen, but I think in her latest episode she knits throughout the whole video because she's doing a Q&A, and it was really nice to see that. It also made me notice something quite specific. When I knit, I use a knitting pin to tension the yarn, but she carries the yarn around her neck, which is actually how I originally learned. At some point, someone introduced me to the pin, and I switched to that. For me, it made a big difference because when I used to knit with the yarn around my neck for long periods of time, it would start to feel uncomfortable, not exactly painful, but it would irritate my skin. So the pin felt like an upgrade. That said, it's not perfect either. I've had a few garments, t shirts, blouses, where the pin ended up making small holes. Pajamas, I don't really mind, but for nicer clothes, I try to be more careful now and choose where I place it. So watching her knit like that made me curious. I don't know if she's tried using a pin and just doesn't like it, or if she simply prefers knitting with the yarn around her neck, but it was interesting to see the difference. I think that's everything I can say about that podcast. I've never actually met Eunice, and even though we live in the same town, it's not something I see myself actively pursuing. But I do get the feeling that she must be a lovely person. And if you enjoy this kind of calm, reflective tone, I would definitely recommend her podcast. The next podcast I want to mention is one that showed up on my YouTube feed very recently, maybe 4 or 5 days ago. I was just checking if the podcasts I usually watch had uploaded anything new, which is something I tend to do almost every day. I go to my YouTube homepage and see what comes up, and this episode caught my attention. The podcast is called The Roaming Knitter, and I have to say, I absolutely love her. There's something very light and natural about her content. Doesn't feel focused on perfection at all. It feels more like someone who has been knitting for many years but is now exploring things in a different way. And I don't mean that in a negative sense at all. I actually think she was always knitting in a way that worked for her. And now she's just allowing herself to try new things. That's what makes it interesting to watch. You're kind of following someone who is experimenting, figuring things out, and doing it in a very honest way. And she's also genuinely funny, not in a forced way, just in the way she talks about what she's doing and why. I even caught myself laughing a few times, which is not something that usually happens with knitting content. Even the little notes she adds on screen. They're subtle, but they add a lot. It's just a very enjoyable podcast to listen to, especially because I'm usually not looking at the screen all the time while I knit. And her content works really well in that format. I really hope she continues because I've been enjoying it a lot. Before I move on to the next podcast, I just want to say that I'm not going into a lot of detail about each one. I'm really just highlighting what stands out to me, the things that make me enjoy listening to them. And this is very personal. Sometimes I stop watching a podcast simply because the voice doesn't feel comfortable to me, and that has nothing to do with the person. It's just how it feels to listen. So, this is just my selection based on what I enjoy. One of the first podcasts I watched from beginning to end is Soph Knits Daily. She's someone I really admire. Again, she has a very calm way of speaking, which is something I clearly value. I'm noticing that as I talk about these podcasts. But more than that, there's a sense of honesty in the way she shares her life and her knitting. It feels like she's living a life that she's comfortable with. And of course, I don't actually know that, but that's the impression I get. And I think that's something most people are looking for, to feel at ease with their choices and with the way they're living. That honesty, or at least that feeling of honesty, is something that really stands out to me. I also feel like she knows what she's talking about. The way she shares her projects and her decisions feels thoughtful and grounded. There is one thing that sometimes makes me a bit unsure, which is her yarn stash. She does have a relatively large stash, not the biggest I've seen, but still quite significant. That said, I do think she makes a real effort to use what she already have, and I appreciate that a lot. So, it's not really a negative, just something I notice. Another aspect of her podcast is that she often combines knitting with traveling. She visits yarn shops and shares those experiences, which adds a different layer to the content. It's not the main reason I watch her, but it's definitely a nice addition. Next, I want to talk about another podcast that I really enjoy. It's the Kniterary. Again, it has the very calm and clean feeling, which is something I clearly value. I really like the overall aesthetic, the light, the way it's filmed. Everything feels very intentional and visually pleasing. She's also the reason why I wanted to try brioche. At some point, she was really into brioche, and I think her enthusiasm for it made me curious. That's actually what led me to start my own brioche projects. I also feel like she has a very strong sense of color, which is something I personally don't feel very confident about. So I find that part of her work really interesting to watch. There are also small things that I enjoy, even if they don't seem that important. For example, she has a dog, and a big one, which is not something I see very often in knitting podcasts. I feel like I see more cats than dogs. And for some reason, I just like that. I don't even consider myself an animal person, but if I had to choose, I would definitely choose dogs. So that's something that stood out to me. Another moment that I really connected with was when she shared that she was pregnant. I think because I have young children myself, and also because I watched all of her episodes in a short period of time, I ended up feeling quite close to her journey. So when she shared that news, I was genuinely happy for her. It felt like a really special moment, especially knowing that it was something she and her husband had wanted for a while. There's also something she does every year that I really loved. For her birthday, she knits a garment for herself and she adds a small tag with her age. So if she turns 28, she adds a 28 tag and so on. I think that's such a beautiful idea. It's a way of marking time with something handmade, something intentional, and it's definitely something I would like to try myself. I don't know if I would be able to be as consistent as she is. Apparently, she hasn't missed a year, but I don't think that should stop me from trying. It doesn't have to be something big, but I really like the idea of creating something special each year, connected to a specific moment. Next, I want to talk about another Portuguese knitting podcast. This one is Maria Melga. It's actually an older podcast and not a very big channel, and I don't know how she feels about that, but honestly, I really like her. The podcast is in Portuguese, so that might also influence her numbers. I don't know if you understand Portuguese, but if you do, I think it's worth checking out. What I really like about her is how honest she feels. It genuinely feels like you're talking to someone in your living room. There's no filter, no performance. She's just putting herself out there. And I have watched a few other Portuguese podcasts, also in Portuguese, and I didn't connect with them in the same way. Sometimes they feel a bit performative or even a bit negative. And I say this including myself. I think we, as Portuguese people, can sometimes have that tendency, but with her, I don't feel that. It just feels simple, direct, and honest. She's also not very regular with her uploads, and I actually think that's part of what makes her feel so authentic. It doesn't feel like she's doing this for numbers or consistency. It feels like she just shares when she wants to share. And when I watch her videos, I really feel like I'm seeing her. There was one thing that made me a bit uncomfortable, let's say. I remember watching an episode where she was organizing all her yarn. It might have been over one or two videos. And then shortly after, I saw another video where she was buying more yarn, and she already had a lot. That gave me that feeling of something not quite sitting right. And I don't mean this in a judgmental way, although I know it can sound like that. I think it just connects with how I see things right now. For me, at the moment, I'm really trying to use what I already have, not just yarn, also fabrics and other materials I have at home. I've been thinking a lot about making things from what I already own and even gifting those things instead of buying new materials. So, seeing that contrast made me reflect a bit. But even with that, I still really enjoy her podcast, and I will keep watching every time she posts because that level of authenticity, that feeling that someone is just being themselves without trying to fit into anything, is not that easy to find. And I think she does that very naturally. It doesn't feel intentional, it just feels like who she is. Another podcast that I've watched from the beginning until now is Lovely Day Knits. She's Australian, and I really like her energy. There's something very positive about her, especially considering that her health condition is not the easiest. And I think that's actually one of the things that stands out the most to me. She keeps trying things, she keeps knitting, and she keeps showing up. It feels like we're watching her grow in her knitting journey almost from the beginning, and that's really nice to see. I also think it's very inspiring to see the life she shares with her husband. Their home, the way they live, the way they adapt to her health condition, it feels very real and very intentional. And her smile is honestly very comforting. She seems to find happiness even when things are not easy. And I think that's something that, at least for me, works as a reminder. Because of her health, she knits a lot. It's something she can do, something that fits her rhythm. So she has a lot of finished pieces to share, which is also fun to watch. And I would say her content leans more towards knitting for the enjoyment of knitting rather than very technical or knowledge heavy content. And I really like that balance. I like having both more technical podcasts and also lighter ones that remind me that knitting is supposed to be enjoyable. And I think she really represents that side. There are a couple of things that, from my personal perspective, are not exactly what I look for. For example, the promotion of products. I do understand why. Health conditions can be expensive, and I completely respect that. It just doesn't add much value for me personally, but it doesn't take away from the rest of the content either. Another small thing is that sometimes I get a bit surprised with how things turn out in her projects. But again, I think that's part of the reality she's sharing. She could easily choose not to show those parts, and she doesn't. And I think that honesty is actually something I appreciate. One thing I've noticed about myself is that when she doesn't post for a while, I get a bit concerned because I don't follow any of these creators on Instagram. I only watch them here on YouTube. Part of that is intentional. I'm trying to focus more on long form content and reduce short form content like Instagram or TikTok. So, YouTube is kind of my space for this, but it also means that when someone like her disappears for a bit, I don't really know why. And I notice that I do worry a little, not in a way that I can do anything about it. It's more just a feeling. But overall, I really enjoy her podcast. It's light, it's positive, and it reminds me that knitting doesn't have to be serious. It can just be something you do because you enjoy it. And now, one of my most recent discoveries is Nikitina Knits. I don't think I've watched anyone new after her yet, so she's probably the latest addition to this list. And I have to say, she really knows knitting. You can tell immediately. She understands construction, she understands garments, she understands yarn, and she speaks with a level of clarity and confidence that makes it very easy to trust what she's saying. It feels like she knows what she's doing and she knows that she knows. And that comes across in a really calm and grounded way. Her podcast has that same calm and clean feeling that I seem to gravitate towards, but with a stronger technical layer. I feel like I actually learn when I watch her. Not in an overwhelming way, though, but in a very natural way. One thing that really stands out to me is her choice of materials and patterns. I sometimes feel like a lot of knitting podcasts end up showing the same things, the same yarns, the same brands, the same patterns. And she does use some of those, of course, but she also brings something different. She explores yarns that I don't usually see people talking about, and her pattern choices feel more intentional and less repetitive. And that, combined with her knowledge, makes the content feel fresh. For me, she brings a really nice balance. She has the knowledge, she has the calm presence, and she also introduces new things, whether that's yarns, patterns, or ways of thinking about knitting. And that's what made me stay. I would definitely recommend giving her podcast a try. I really feel like she adds value to the knitting community. Another podcast that feels like a bit of fresh air to me is Yarn at the Barn. You probably noticed that most of the podcasts I've been mentioning are quite recent, maybe 1 or 2 years old. And I don't fully know why, but I think I naturally tend to gravitate towards smaller or newer creators, not necessarily because they're small, but because they're still building something. And I think that feels more relatable to me, especially since I'm also starting this channel and trying to understand what I want to do with it. What I like about her is that she feels different. She has her own thing going on. I think she has animals, horses, which is not something I see often in this space, and that already brings a different energy to the channel. And I like that. Not because people need to be different, but because it feels like you're seeing a real person with a real life, not just knitting content. Her podcast has a very cozy and slightly funny tone. There are moments that feel a bit unexpected or even a bit chaotic in a good way, and I enjoy that. It doesn't feel overly structured, and I think that's part of the charm. I wouldn't say she's the one I watch the most regularly. It's more something I go to when I want a longer episode and I don't feel like switching between videos all the time. She tends to have longer episodes, which works really well for me when I'm knitting. There's also one of her earlier episodes. I think it's about her first knitted garment that I remember being really funny. Some of the things that happened, I don't even fully understand how they happened, to be honest. But that's also what makes it entertaining. So, yeah, I would say give it a try. Maybe start with that episode and see how you feel about it. Another podcast that I've really been enjoying is Jamie Sage Knits. I remember watching her first episode and immediately feeling like she was very authentic. And I still feel that way. One thing that I've noticed over time is how much more comfortable she has become on camera. There's actually one episode where she's with friends, and you can clearly see that difference. She's much more at ease being filmed. And I really like seeing that kind of growth. It's not about being better or worse, it's just about becoming more comfortable in your own space. And that's always nice to watch. In terms of her knitting choices, I would say that she sometimes makes choices that wouldn't necessarily be mine, especially when it comes to colors. But at the same time, I do like many of the things she makes. And I think that's also part of the experience of watching different creators, seeing perspectives that are not exactly your own. She also shares knowledge about yarn, which I really appreciate. I would say, and this is just my personal impression, that she doesn't go as deep into yarn knowledge as someone like Nikitina Knits, for example, but she still brings a lot of value in that area. And one thing that I really respect is that she actually uses the yarn she buys. I never get the feeling that she's just collecting yarn for the sake of it. Even when she goes to events and buys more than she might immediately need, it feels like that yarn eventually becomes part of a project. And that's something that matters to me. There's also a more personal side that I found really meaningful. She got married, and although she didn't really share the event itself, which I actually think is completely fair, you could still feel that it was an important moment in her life. She shared the garments she made for it, but kept the rest private. And I really respect that balance. And I don't know, I think I just genuinely enjoy seeing good things happening to people, even if I don't know them personally. It's a bit like observing from a distance, not in an intrusive way, but just appreciating that someone is living their life in a way that feels right for them. And that brings me a bit of joy. So, yes, I would definitely recommend giving her podcast a try. And for the last podcast in this list, I chose Sudden Knits. This is another smaller and more recent channel, and I think she brings a really interesting mix. On one hand, she shares her experience, and on the other, she brings very practical and structured information. For example, her latest video was about knitting your own shorts or pants, and I found it very insightful, not just because of the specific topic, but because she explains the math behind it. So, even though the video is about shorts, the logic can be applied to many other garments. Of course, depending on the level you're aiming for, that information might not be enough to create a very refined garment, especially if you compare it to someone like Nikitina Knits, for example, but it's definitely enough to create garments. And I think that's very valuable. Another detail that I found really interesting is that she actually started knitting Portuguese style. She's not Portuguese, I think she's Turkish. So that was just a coincidence. But for me, it was a nice add on because I still feel like Portuguese knitting is not very visible online. I know it exists. I've seen it in real life and even in some podcasts. And I've had people tell me that in places like Brazil, for example, it's actually very common. But online, I still don't see it that much. So I do feel like, in my own way, I'm adding something to the community. And if one day I don't feel that way anymore, I can always stop. But for now, I think it still makes sense. Another thing that stands out about her is that she often uses yarn from frogged garments. She buys pieces and reuses the yarn, and I think that's incredibly sustainable. At the same time, I have to say that it's not something I see myself doing, not because I don't think it's valuable. I actually think it's a great practice, but I don't think I would get the same joy from knitting that way. And I think that's okay. You can appreciate something without wanting to do it yourself. So, yes, I think she's fresh, relatable, and she shares useful knowledge. And that brings me to the end of my top 10 for now. I also wanted to quickly mention two channels that I don't watch regularly, but that I still find very valuable. The first one is Andrea Mowry. I don't really follow her podcast content, but I really respect the knowledge she shares. I actually found her through a mention in another podcast when they were talking about her blocking method, and that made me curious enough to go and look into it myself. Even though I don't watch her content regularly, I do appreciate what she brings, especially in terms of design and color work. And I'm pretty sure I will end up knitting one of her patterns at some point. The second one is Very Pink Knits. This one I use in a very specific way. I go there to learn. Her videos are short, clear, and very focused. So whenever I need to understand a technique, that's usually where I go. And I think she explains things beautifully. So those are my honorable mentions. And that's it for this episode. I know there are many more podcasts out there, and I'm sure I'll discover new ones over time. So if you're ever looking for more recommendations, you can leave me a comment. I'm always happy to share what I find interesting. And that's everything for today. I hope to see you next time. And until then, happy knitting.